Calcium is approximately 1,000 times higher in concentration outside as compared to inside. How does that happen, and why does it matter? Calcium pumps move calcium outside and use a phosphate on an ATP to do that. The result in a typical cell is 1,000 times calcium concentrations outside. Why do cells bother? What's that for? Unlike sodium and potassium, there's almost no calcium inside the cell. It's at very low concentrations unless channels open. So the high concentration of calcium outside stays there. That allows calcium to be used as a second messenger. So when a gated channel opens, calcium moves into the cell. Remember, the inside of the cell at rest of a typical cell is somewhere around minus 70 millivolts. So a cation, a positive ion, would move in, and it's going down a concentration gradient. Inside the cell, calcium can bind to calcium binding proteins that in turn interact with other proteins to change protein function or transcription and translation. Of course, in the background, calcium is constantly being pumped out. So what happens is that we have a resting cell with high calcium outside. Some environmental event opens calcium channels, and there's a wave of calcium, and calcium enters the cell. But this time is brief because that calcium is being pumped out. So after this period of calcium coming in, the channels close and we go back to having low calcium. That's critical for a second messenger because removing the calcium allows the cell to turn off whatever that calcium signaled. So the binding proteins that had calcium, that calcium escapes and is pumped out of the cell. Cells have multiple locations to store calcium. They pump calcium outside the cell. They pump calcium into specialized endoplasmic reticulum and into the space between the double membrane of the nucleus. So the location of high calcium is outside the cell, inside storage areas in some cells, and in the space between the membranes of the nucleus, depending upon whether or not there are calcium pumps in those locations. Remember, it's always calcium is pumped out of the cytoplasm. It comes in through channels. It's pumped out using ATP and in through channels. It should make sense to you that calcium moves in through channels because channels are fast. All they have to do is open and the calcium will begin to move. Pumps are slow. It takes time for the calcium to bind, for the ATP attachment, the conversion, the change in shape, and the movement of calcium. Pumps are slow. They take time. So moving calcium out takes time, but when there's a message, that's fast. The calcium comes in quickly.